My name is Gabriel Meyer. I'm the executive director of the Ruskin Art Club, and we're delighted to welcome all of you to this annual Ruskin Lecture. This is the 20th annual Ruskin Lecture, and it's important to note that this is taking place in the context of the bicentennial celebrations of Ruskin's birth. First of all, here in Southern California, where we're doing a number of activities throughout this 2019 Ruskin year, but also significant events going on in the UK, in Italy, in Europe, and in Japan, where there's a great interest, has been a great interest of Ruskin for more than a century. The Ruskin Art Club is Los Angeles' oldest cultural association, and we date back to that initial impulse of interest in Ruskin's vision, 1888, while he was still alive, and that vision of an integrated life in which art and life radically inform and also radically challenge each other. We're always proud to co-host this event with USC and with our friends here at the Doheny Libraries. And we're delighted also again to have this opportunity to celebrate Ruskin's legacy in the 21st century in a time when when there's renewed interest in his ideas and also in the relevance of those ideas to the particular predicaments, might be the right word, that we find ourselves in, aesthetically, economically, socially, and in terms of the environment, where Ruskin truly was a prophet, a tragic prophet, but a prophet. We're getting very good press this year, both in the UK and in the United States. I was telling someone 20 years ago when you talked about what an important and relevant figure Ruskin was, you got raised eyebrows. Now we're in the New York Times. So in 20 years, things have moved along. The recent New York Times piece, which is February 5th, why John Ruskin, born 200 years ago, is the man of the moment. It concludes just as and I think this is important to say, this isn't just an exotic interest in a Victorian thinker or even a particular respect for the insights of a great forebear. As this article ends, I think, pointedly, Ruskin holds our feet to the moral fire. This is the New York Times. He makes us disconcerted. Ruskin is a spot-on critic of modern America, and he is as relevant now as he was then. What would Ruskin have made of post-truth politics, of the richest 1% owning almost half the world's wealth, of a plastic-strewn planet where climate change may be beyond repair? Maybe we should go back to him. He saw it coming. It's a particular pleasure to welcome Professor Robert Hewison in our midst tonight. And particularly appropriate, I think, that he should be giving the Ruskin Lecture in this Ruskin year. For many decades, Robert has been one of the most reliable, I would think, of modern commentators on Ruskin, with a fair-mindedness and a breadth of view that I think have marked him out in a very special way. I say that also on personal grounds. Robert was one of the first commentators I turned to when I was trying to find my way sort of into Ruskin, and I read John Ruskin, The Argument of the Eye. Sounds familiar somehow. And this is at, what, 76, is that right? Yeah, 76, one of your first book, right, on Ruskin, and still one of the, I think, one of the best in terms of exploring Ruskin's aesthetic philosophy. Safe to say, Robert has had, in the years since 1976, has had a real influence on the revival of interest in Ruskin. Ruskin's other major books include New Approaches to Ruskin, Ruskin, Turner, and the Pre-Raphaelites, and in 2009, Ruskin on Venice, the Paradise of Cities. I would also mention that we have a brand new Robert Hewison book, Ruskin and His Contemporaries, which I'm just halfway through devouring, and it's marvelous. Essays on Ruskin and Oscar Wilde, Ruskin and Darwin, marvelous essays. We had hoped to get some copies here for the lecture, but we're unable to. But we have samples of all this book that you can covet on the table. Also, to go on with the curriculum vitae, Robert was also professor, the Slade Professor of Fine Arts at Oxford, a position that many of you may know was created originally for Ruskin in 1869. One of, I think, the sources really of the particular insights I think that Ruskin brings, at least for me, for this reader, with Ruskin is the breadth of his experience, that he's not simply an academician, but he comes also with a career in journalism, in broadcast journalism, and he was the drama critic for the London Sunday Times for 35 years. As many of you know, we hosted a concert last month in honor of Ruskin's actual birthday at the Hancock Museum here at USC, and it was an event inspired by Robert's multimedia extravaganza held at the Royal Academy at the same time. Robert and I have had the pleasure of many hours of discussing Ruskin and his meaning to us in the 21st century in the past few days, and I think it's only fair to bring all of you into the conversation. Professor Robert Hewison.
Thank you so much, Gabriel. And may I say, you know, it's traditional that, you know, speakers say, oh, what an honor it is. But let me say, this really is an honor to be the guest of the Ruskin Art Club, because I feel a real touch of Ruskin there, since there is a contiguity, a contemporaneity there. And Gabriel, who's been, as it were, Virgil to my Dante in Los Angeles, drove me out there, and I saw the exterior of the original clubhouse and so on, and I felt a frisson, you know, I really did. I felt a frisson. But to business. The title, I agree, may be familiar since I've been using it since 1976, but it does actually suggest the connection that I'm trying to make, which is between the word, argument, the argument, and the image, the eye. And I suppose we could begin by asking ourselves, what kind of image do we have of John Ruskin in this bicentennial year of 2019? I think for a long time, people thought of him, if they thought of him at all, they thought of him like this. This is him photographed in 1895, perhaps responding to a letter from the Ruskin Art Club, I don't know. Photographed by Hollier. This is almost at the end of his life. After all, he dies in 1900. This is Ruskin, the Victorian sage, a prophet, as Gabriel has suggested, misunderstood in his own country, who since the 1860s has devoted much of his energy to denouncing the economic and industrial system that was destroying nature, ruining man, and making art impossible. But we can also think of Ruskin like this. This is Ruskin in 1857, at the age of 38, and the gleam in his eye, I think, suggests that he is probably nearing the height of his powers. It's drawn by his family, by a family friend, George Richmond. Now this makes us think of him, I think, much more as a brilliant young man, challenging the critical conventions of early Victorian England. At this date, he is known as the ardent advocate of the Gothic revival in books like The Stones of Venice. He is a defender of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood and a passionate proponent of the work of J.M.W. Turner in the ongoing series of volumes known as Modern Painters. What had begun in 1843 with the first volume as a defense of Turner had become, in the succeeding volumes, a long meditation on the relationship between nature, the creation of God, and art, the creation of man. A couple of years later, after this drawing, he is going to have the confidence and courage and the anger to set out to challenge the ruling economic liberalism of the times with his book Unto This Last. Well, it's not really feasible, as I'm sure you'll appreciate, in one lecture, or indeed, in Ruskin's case, 10 lectures, to do justice to every aspect of Ruskin's life and thought. That would involve discussing aesthetics, economics, geology, botany, philology, theology, interests that he himself never kept in separate compartments, but always was trying to bring them together into a moral unity. And similarly, in a lecture of this sort, I'm not going to be able to say a great deal about the desperate tragedies of his private life, though I will be talking about some of it. So, I'm going to concentrate on a single theme, which I think helps us find a kind of synthesis between these different interests and experiences. And that is the very special relationship that exists in Ruskin's work between the word and the image. I'd like to show how a man whose reputation for the beauty of his prose lasted a lot longer than admiration for his ideas had a primarily visual imagination, and that visual ideas and actual images are the foundations of his written words, which is why I have called this the argument of the eye. Now, my title begins to justify itself when you appreciate that what makes Ruskin distinctive from most other major Victorian thinkers is quite simply that he could draw as well as he could write. So as a result, it's possible to follow the development of his ideas through his own drawings. He never thought of himself as a professional artist, but the practice of making visual studies of his subject gave his writings on art and architecture a specific kind of authority. I always say to my students, I've been teaching at Columbia recently, the great thing is the language, yes, it's difficult, but you can have this absolutely direct connection because there's nothing between you and the drawing. So why am I showing you this particular drawing? Well, it's a very informal, not really finished sketch, but I'm doing so for a reason. Ruskin made it in Venice towards, that's pretty obvious, I suppose you could work that out, in Venice towards the end of 1876. It's drawn from the balcony of his hotel room on the Grand Canal, which was right next door to the little Gothic palace, the Casa Contarini Fasan. Now you see this little Gothic detail. That is the balcony of the neighboring palace, which is this beautiful 14th century little gem of a palace. And of course, from his hotel room. You can see that he was looking down into the basin of St. Mark's, now totally defiled by cruise ships. There is San Giorgio Maggiore, and just here, that's the Punta della Dogana, the customs post on the head of Dorsoduro. And then, of course, the Church of the Salute is about here. Why was Ruskin in Venice? Well, it's because he'd taken a year's leave from his post as the first Slade Professor of Fine Art at Oxford, a position which he'd taken up in 1870. He'd taken a year's leave because he actually wanted a break from his battle with the authorities at Oxford. Ruskin was never an easy man when it came to dealing with institutions, but more importantly, he was trying to get over his grief at the death the year before of Rose Latouche, the young woman whom he had hoped to marry, but who had rejected him, and as she descended into a form of religious mania before dying at the age of 27. We think of anorexia nervosa. This is Ruskin's portrait of Rose Latouche at the age of 13 or 14. You could say that in this year, 1876, Ruskin, now aged 57, was at the halfway point between young radical and old sage. And indeed, during this winter in Venice, he experienced a kind of midlife crisis where he very nearly went mad for the first time. He survived, he made it through, but it did prompt him to write a fragment of autobiography, one that allows us into his mind, where we can explore his intellectual formation and see how certain images helped to shape his ideas. This visit to Venice was the longest he'd made since the completion of his masterpiece, The Stones of Venice, a study of the moral and cultural fall of the city that he'd completed in 1853. When he went back, he had hoped to recapture all the delight of first knowing Venice as he had as a young boy in the 1830s. But the 19th century had caught up with the city, and so much has changed. He wrote to a friend, "To find all the places we had loved turned into railroad stations and dust heaps. There are no words for the withering and disgusting pain." In February 1877, Ruskin moved out of his hotel on the Grand Canal, from which he'd done that earlier drawing, to cheaper lodgings above a trattoria on the Zatteri. Those of you who know Venice will know it's the long embankment that looks south across a wide sweep of water lying between the main body of Venice and the island of the Giudecca, which was then basically a proletarian and industrial area. This particular view was painted that very year of 1877 by a young American painter, John H. Twachtman. And the building where Ruskin stayed has since been replaced by the Calcina Hotel. Where he stayed was just here. That's where the little trattoria was. And now the Calcina Hotel stands there. And being a hotel, it has a plaque which says, "Yes, Ruskin stayed here," which of course is completely untrue because the building did not exist. This is a very early example of the heritage industry at work. Nonetheless, when on the 8th of February this year, the Venetians recognized Ruskin and they hung a wreath which I thought was a wonderful thing, and there was a service in the English church in Venice and all those things. So, you know, the Venetians have come to appreciate what Ruskin was trying to do for Venice. This is another view of the Zattere. This is Ruskin's own, looking the other way, and this is the Chiesa dei Gesuati. So, it is the 4th of March, dawn, and Ruskin is at his desk as he prepares to write this fragment of autobiography. And the moon is still visible in a soft sky. Inside the room that he's using as his study are a mass of books and papers, sheets of proof for correction, letters to and from his many correspondents, rapid sketches scribbled during his trips by gondola, and the careful watercolour studies that he was making of Carpaccio's painting of the Dream of St Ursula. In the room there are plaster casts of sculptures of the Ducal Palace, histories and guidebooks to Venice, the 13th edition of John Murray's Handbook for the Traveller in Venice. There is a copy in Greek of Plato's Laws, from which he tries to translate a certain amount every morning. And then, to distract him from more serious work, there is also a copy of Casanova's memoirs. Seahorses swim in a glass bowl. There is a cockle shell from the Venetian island of St Helena, picked up during a rowing expedition. There is an Italian missal, his mother's Bible, and a 14th century illuminated version besides. Now, Ruskin loved this view from his study, but there is a lime kiln on the Giudecca island opposite that blows white smoke in a cloud across the water. And large steamers sometimes pass within 30 yards of his window, and the scream of their whistles and the rattle of their steam cranes are a strain on his nerves. Now, this being the 4th of March, as usual, he has set aside the first few days of the month in order to write the next number of his pamphlet, Fors Clavigera, the monthly letters to working men of England, a personal newsletter which nowadays I think you could justifiably say is the very first blog. It certainly has all the personality and idiosyncrasies of being a kind of blog as he reacts to events. Now, these public letters were the most direct form of communication that he had, apart, of course, from giving lectures. The number he was writing for April would contain important news about his plans for social reform. Before coming to Venice, he'd been to Sheffield to talk to a group of men who wanted to set up a communal farming experiment. And he had agreed to help them by providing the land rent-free. And now a small farm just outside Sheffield had been bought, and Ruskin wanted to give his Sheffield workers some advice on coming into their property. In spite of the noise from the steamer Pachino, making ready for the Sunday run to Trieste, Ruskin was at work as the moon set. Here's another sketch by Ruskin of the Zattere, looking at the Gesuati from the other side. Now, I have a very particular reason for describing the circumstances of the 4th of March, 1877, in such detail. The minutiae of this particular morning don't just set the scene. I'm not writing a film here. I mean, the nature of the man we are dealing with meant that things that might seem insignificant to others were full of meaning to him. What the weather was like, what objects were immediately to hand, could be very important for Ruskin's mood and his choice of subject. It's always useful as an academic to know what books a writer was reading, But in Ruskin's case, they were just one kind of inspiration. The cockle shell and the snail shell appear elsewhere in Fors Clavigera. And that morning, when he looked up from his table because of the noise of the steamer Pachino, he was surprised to see that the cross of St. George was painted on her bows. St. George was the patron saint of his utopian society, the Guild of St. George. And the steam cranes and Plato and St. George all made their way into his work that day. Ruskin wanted to advise the Sheffield workers who were to take over the farm he bought on how to run their affairs. And this advice was supposed to be set in the wider context of his plans for social reform. As Plato had prescribed laws for an ideal society, so Ruskin would prescribe his. He'd been trying to get these ideas on the Guild of St. George down on paper for the past 3 mornings. But when he saw the cross of St. George on the bows of the steamer, this seemed to confirm that this, yes, should be the topic for the next number of Fors Clavigera. But to explain the creed, the beliefs of the Guild, he felt he had first to explain his own. And that indeed involves saying something about the course of his life. So, turning to the blank sheet of paper that every writer has to face every morning, he began to write a memoir that turns into a kind of self-portrait. And this is a self-portrait. It's difficult to date. Some say it's 1875, some say it's not even by Ruskin, but I feel very strongly that this is probably, this A is by Ruskin, and B probably dates from around this period, 1877-8. Certainly it's a serious portrait of a serious man at a serious time. In this self-portrait, Ruskin sets out to analyze the course of his spiritual life, but he does so in very unusual terms. He begins by saying, I quote, "All my first books, to the end of the Stones of Venice, were written in the simple belief I had been taught as a child, and especially the second volume of Modern Painters was an outcry of enthusiastic praise of religious painting, in which you will find me placing Fra Angelico above all other painters." This is the study that Ruskin made in 1845 of the upper part of a reliquary decorated by Fra Angelico in the convent of St. Mark's in Florence. In the 1840s, a taste for the Quattrocento painters, who were then often simply referred to as primitives, was quite advanced. And Ruskin, brought up as an evangelical Protestant, risked getting into trouble with his parents for this liking for Catholic art. Ruskin wanted to explain the progress of his spiritual life through his ideas on art. His justification was that the teaching of art is the teaching of all things. Now that may sound a bit glib, but for Ruskin, this was an article of faith, of religious faith throughout his life. The conviction that art was an expression of the love and will of God, though, had been established long before he knew very much about Fra Angelico, or indeed about art at all. This is a panorama of the Alps, which Ruskin drew in 1844. The source of Ruskin's faith was nature, which he understood in terms that were at the same time romantic, religious, and scientific. Nature, the Alps, is the source of a sense of the spiritual and the sublime, as in the poetry of Wordsworth, or the Alps as Ruskin drew them. this belief was also religious because the principles of natural theology taught that the earth was the creation of God, and the surface of the earth bore the traces of the handwriting of God. And then, at the same time, though, this approach was also scientific, because if it was the creation of God, then nature should be studied in terms of geology and botany in order to increase the knowledge of the work of God. So, the simple belief I had been taught as a child was pushing Ruskin towards a visual understanding of the world. From a young age, he made collections of minerals, at the same time trying to express his passion for the external world in poems modelled on Wordsworth and Byron, and through his own picturesque drawings. The contemporary artist, or the modern painter, who brought all these ideas together for Ruskin was Joseph William Mallard Turner. And in 1836, when he was just 15 years old, Ruskin had a chance to defend the man who would become his hero. In 1836, Turner showed this painting, which he called Juliet and Her Nurse, in the annual Royal Academy exhibition. As you know, we all associate Juliet with Verona, but it appears she was on a day trip, because here is Juliet and her nurse enjoying the splendor of the fireworks and the displays and the sort of carnival scene in Venice. Unfortunately, this painting gave violent offense to the neoclassical taste of the art critic of the conservative Blackwood's magazine. Perhaps he thought Turner was being a bit naughty, bringing Juliet to Venice in this way. Young Ruskin rose in Turner's defense, protesting in an essay that the painting was not the mess of absurd colors and false perceptions that the critic of Blackwood's claimed it to be, but that it was a true representation of the scene, both accurate and sublime. Well, Ruskin's essay wasn't published until after his death. His father sent it to Turner for his opinion, and Turner, being a bit of a curmudgeon and not liking publicity, said, no, don't bother, no, leave them alone. But the manuscript survives, so we know about it, and I would argue that at this moment that Ruskin begins to find his direction in life. Now, the way ahead was not at first clear. Like many young people, he began by following the tastes of his parents, who liked to collect pictures of pleasant and picturesque landscapes constructed on the conventions that derived from the landscape painters of the 18th century. But as Ruskin learned more about Turner and got to know him by buying his work, this view of the Pass of Fido on the St. Gothard in Switzerland was directly commissioned by Ruskin from Turner in 1843. Through this close connection with the artist, he began to appreciate Turner's genius and set out to argue for the profundity and modernity of Turner's vision in modern painters. Here is Ruskin, aged 24 at the time of the publication of the first volume of Modern Painters in 1843. It's based on a now lost portrait. That volume was well received, but this was only the beginning of a project that would not be completed until the appearance of the fifth volume in 1860. And in truth, when he started, Ruskin's knowledge of art and art history was pretty limited. In fact, it wasn't until after he had published that first volume that he decided, well, perhaps he really should make a serious study trip to France and Italy. He'd already travelled on the continent with his parents several times before, but in 1845, for the very first time, he set out for Europe on his own. Well, apart from a servant and one or two people to help him, of course. And as Ruskin describes in this fragment of autobiography, the effect of that journey was overwhelming. For a start, in Florence, where he discovered this reliquary by Fra Angelico. This is the bit that who's the drawing of I'd showed you earlier. In Florence, he had to admit that there were artists who painted in a very different way to Turner. In spite of his Protestant prejudices, he accepted the religious spirit of Angelico and other artists who literally were pre-Raphael, and saw that their religious vision was as valid as the romantic imagery of Turner. He wrote in a letter to his father that in the list of great religious painters, he had to put Angelico in a class by himself. He is not an artist, properly called, but an inspired saint. And that is why the second volume of Modern Painters became that outcry of enthusiastic praise of religious painting. But Fra Angelico was not the only discovery that Ruskin made in 1845. Years later, he would write that he regretted he ever gone on from Florence to Venice. First of all, the decay of many of the buildings shocked him, and the restorations that were being made also made him furious. Does anybody know what this building is? I shouldn't think so, because now it's been so restored, it's been restored to an inch of its life. It's actually the Fondaco dei Turchi, which was restored in the 1860s. So in order to record as much as possible of what he saw, Ruskin did two things. He began to acquire examples of that early form of photography, the daguerreotype, and because he was beginning to see architecture differently, he began to change the way he drew. This study of the principal arcade on the front of the Casa Loredan, the Byzantine Arcade, is no longer conventionally picturesque. It's not a composed image, nicely placed, even though the observant will see that he quite likes this little bit of weed growing out of the thing, growing out of the cask, and so on. But it is a full head-on study where Ruskin is looking for facts. And there was yet another discovery to be made in Venice. The religious content of works by Angelico was enough to justify Ruskin's pleasure in looking at them, but in Venice he was seduced by the sensual powers of Titian and Tintoretto, and his Protestant conscience was troubled. This is Tintoretto's Annunciation. Recalling his feelings in 1877, Ruskin wrote, "I discovered the gigantic power of Tintoret and found that there was quite a different spirit in that from the spirit of Angelico. And analysing Venetian work carefully, I found and told fearlessly, in spite of my love of the masters, that there was no religion whatever in any work of Titian's, and that Tintoret only occasionally forgot himself into religion." Well, the power of Tintoretto was indeed gigantic. One day, having idled by the canals and sketched the market boats, Ruskin and his friend and latest drawing master, J.D. Harding, wandered into the halls of the Scuola di San Rocco, and they were overwhelmed by what they saw. Now, we're all used to seeing pictures, Tintoretto and so on. Imagine, it's 1845, there's no photography, there's no colour, there are no books, and you see this for the first time, smack, the real thing. Ruskin wrote home to his father, "I have had such a draught of pictures today, enough to drown me. I never was so utterly crushed to the earth before any human intellect as I was today before Tintoretto." Ruskin found that he felt obliged to delay his departure from Venice in order to make this black and white study from the central section of the Crucifixion. I think you can see the intensity of his response in the vigor of his drawing. In his list of painters, Tintoretto was now in the school of art at the top of everything. The sensuous nature of the experience of seeing Tintoretto was a reminder to Ruskin of his own humanity. A repressed only child of elderly middle-class evangelical Protestant parents, he felt a delight in the faculty of sight that helped to compensate for other pleasures that were unknown to him. The consequence of the experience in the Scuola di San Rocco was not simply a major revision of modern painters. Ruskin felt that there was a connection between the art of Tintoretto and the city of Venice that seemed to be crumbling around him. A link was made in his mind between art, man, and society. He wrote, "Tintoretto swept me away at once into the mare maggiore, the wider sea of the schools of painting which crowned the power and perished in the fall of Venice, so forcing me into the study of the history of Venice herself, and through that into what else I have traced or told of the laws of national strength and virtue." The effect of this conjunction of art and social questions can be seen in the more critical attitude developing in Ruskin's drawings. Now, this drawing of 1846 of the south side of St. Mark's after rain is actually a lovely drawing. It's beautifully sensitive. If you've ever been in Venice and there's been a shower of rain, you know how the marble pavements glisten? And he's achieved all that, you know, just with a couple of brush strokes. It's brilliant. So you think, and this is very nicely composed with the edge of the Ducal Palace Broglio there. But, look, there, number three, and there are one or two others. He's also making notes in a notebook, and that letter, number 3, refers to a long analysis of the marble and what it's for and so on. So he's writing up his ideas in a notebook. And of course, this decision to study Venetian cultural history led, of course, to The Stones of Venice, published in 3 volumes between 1851 and 1853. And it led to drawings, if you can call it a drawing, like this. Ruskin rapidly discovered that the literary evidence about the architectural history of Venice was confused, non-existent, or contradictory. And so he was forced to turn to the evidence of his own eyes. And he made an intense study of the fabric of the city, measuring and drawing in notebooks and worksheets like this. This is a study of the tracery in the windows on the piano nobile of the Car d'Oro. And he's actually got, we know exactly what date it was done, number 17, November the 19th, etc. And he would do at least 1 or 2 of these a day, write them up in a small notebook and then in a big notebook. So there is a whole elaborate critical study. And, of course, he wasn't just drawing. He was making plaster casts, and he bought his own daguerreotype machine. This was also the time when he began to promote another group of modern painters, the Pre-Raphaelites. And here is Ruskin, painted by Millay, a portrait begun just as he was writing the index to the Stones of Venice. We won't go into the marital issues surrounding this particular painting, which is still a magnificent work, now the Ashmolean. Ruskin argued in the Stones of Venice that there was a direct connection between the condition of art and the health of the nation that produced it, and applied to the whole historical and architectural fabric of the city that kind of analysis. Now, these human interests pulled against the spiritual, for he found that although the religious painters depicted a spiritual vision that as a religious man he could respect, their art did not seem so great to him and did not give so much pleasure to him as those of more worldly men. In 1858, these conflicts came to a crisis point in Turin, and once more the crisis was in front of a picture, Veronese's Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Here is the Queen of Sheba. Solomon is right up there. And the observant amongst you will see there's a camel there, which is rather nice. And so on. Now, Ruskin gives two accounts of the spiritual change that overtook him in 1858, one written on that morning in Venice in 1877, another later in his unfinished autobiography, Praeterita. The accounts differ, although the result is the same. Ruskin sloughs off the evangelical Protestant faith of his childhood. In the first version, he leaves his work in the art gallery in Turin. What he's doing is making copies of various sections of this painting. He leaves the art gallery in Turin, and he goes to hear a Protestant service in an evangelical chapel. A little squeaking idiot was preaching to an audience of 17 old women and 3 louts that they were the only children of God in Turin, and that all the people in Turin outside the chapel and all the people in the world out of sight of Monteviso would be damned. And I came out of the chapel in some of 20 years of thought, a conclusively unconverted man. Now, in the later version, in his autobiography, the moment of decision is not so sudden. After the service, he goes back to the gallery, and it's there, in front of this picture, that the essential change takes place. Here's a detail with the Queen of Sheba and her maids. Ruskin writes, Paul Veronese's Solomon and the Queen of Sheba glowed in full afternoon light. The gallery windows being open, there came in with the warm air floating swells and falls of military music from the courtyard before the palace, which seemed more devotional in their perfect art, tune, and discipline than anything I remembered of the evangelical hymns. And as the perfect colour and sound gradually asserted their power on me, they seemed finally to fasten me in the old article of the Jewish faith, that things done delightfully and rightly were always done by the help and in the Spirit of God. This second version, I think, tells us more clearly what happened to Ruskin. He'd been suffering religious doubts for years, but it took a picture, the argument of the eye, to decide him finally. It was, in fact, a synesthetic moment, for not only was there the sensual beauty of Veronese, but also music, so that perfect colour and sound combined to ease him of the problem that had troubled him for so long. The change was not the result of a carefully argued debate between two sets of religious principles. It was a choice of images between the negative sterility of the Protestant chapel and the jewels and colours of Veronese. So Angelico, Tintoretto, and now Veronese mark the milestones in his life. One effect of the moment in the gallery in Turin, however, was that Ruskin moved away from the study of art for a while. His religion, as he explains in his account of 1877, was now the religion of humanity, and that meant engaging in human problems. The 1860s are the years of social criticism of Unto This Last, when he found that, however popular he may have been as an art critic, his attack on the economic philosophy of his day was considered ridiculous. Contact with art was not lost, for his argument was still that the quality of art was an index of the health of a nation. But he now believed that the necessary medicine of reform, in his case a return to pre-industrial systems of social values, this should be applied directly to society if art was to thrive. Thus, he said of this portrait of Doge Andrea Gritti, which he bought in 1864, believing it to be by Titian, though in fact it turns out to be by Catena, he said that this tells you everything essential to know about the power of Venice in his day. The breed of her race, their self-command, their subtlety, their courage, their refinement of sensitive faculty, and their noble methods of work. And making a point about the political leadership of his own day, he remarks, the Venetian picture should be especially interesting to us English, for it is the portrait of a merchant king. What would you say about Brexit? Being free of the blinkers of religious dogma, Ruskin was able to take a wider view of art, and he began to create for himself a system that could apply to all art of all times. Art made sense of the world through images and symbols, if one knew how to look. He discovered fresh artists to admire, Carpaccio in Venice, Botticelli in Florence. In 1874, the sight of Botticelli's Madonna Enthroned and Madonna Crowned in Florence left him, he wrote, more crushed than ever by art since I lay down on the floor of the Scuola di San Rocco before the crucifixion, back in 1845. The search took him back to the religious painters, and once again a turning point was reached in front of a picture. In 1874, Ruskin travelled to Assisi, where he began to study this fresco in the lower church, which was then attributed to Giotto. Now it's simply attributed to the Master of the Veils. It is the marriage of poverty and St. Francis. Jesus, as you see, poverty is on the left and St. Francis on the right. In spite of the experience at Turin, Ruskin was still nagged by the apparent conflict between the ability to paint well, that is to say, to render the truth of appearance, and the ability to paint religious truth. At Assisi, the problem was solved while he copied this fresco. He wrote in 1877, while making this drawing, note, while making this drawing, he's studying. While making this drawing, I discovered the fallacy under which I had been tormented for 16 years. The fallacy that religious artists were weaker than irreligious. I found that all Giotto's weaknesses, so-called, were merely absence of material science. He did not know and could not in his day so much of perspective as Titian, so much of the laws of light and shade, or so much of technical composition. But I found he was in the make of him and contents a very much stronger and greater man than Titian. That the things I had fancied easy in his work, because they were so unpretending and simple, were nevertheless entirely inimitable. That the religion in him, instead of weakening, had solemnized and developed every faculty of his heart and hand. And finally, that his work, in all the innocence of it, was yet a human achievement and possession quite above everything that Titian had ever done. This reconciliation with religious painting helped to reconcile Ruskin with religion itself. Veronese had helped him out of the narrow Protestantism of his youth, but he found that living without any hope of an afterlife was as difficult as living in fear of eternal hell. The return to belief was not a step back into earlier attitudes, rather it was an expansion, as he saw first that Protestantism and then agnosticism were too narrow to permit a full comprehension of the world. As he says himself, he became Catholic in the true sense of the word. The problem for Ruskin's audience, though, was that his expanded vision seemed to be becoming more and more mystical. Privately, in a sense, it was, for since the 1860s, he'd begun to take an interest in spiritualism. In his public writing, because he wanted to bring all things to unity, he would jump from subject to subject in a confusing manner. And although he would be discussing quite simple things, he would give them deep significance. The fresco at Assisi had an apparent simplicity, even crudity, but iconographically it's very complicated. And in the same way, Ruskin used a personal symbolism that others found hard to understand. And this mystical strain had become even more apparent during his stay in Venice in 1876-7. Since September, he had been making a study of Carpaccio's The Dream of St Ursula, part of a large cycle of paintings of the life of the saint made in the 1490s that hung in the Accademia Gallery, where they still do. He'd had this painting taken down from the walls and placed in a private room so he could study it more closely. And this is his copy. It's only about that high. This is an intense watercolor copy by Ruskin, amongst other studies that he was making of the picture. He found this work extremely difficult, and as he struggled with his copies, the painting began to take on an intense personal meaning. 2 years before this winter in Venice, Rose Latouche, the girl whose refusal of his love had caused him so much suffering, as I said earlier, had died. Increasingly, Ruskin identified Carpaccio's sleeping saint. There she is, lying in bed. This is the angel coming to tell her of her future martyrdom. Increasingly, Ruskin identified the sleeping saint with his dead love. At Christmas time, a friend sent him a pot of carnations, very like the flowers on St Ursula's windowsill. And art and life came together in a very painful way. He believed that the flowers were a sign that Rose Latouche was trying to communicate with him through the picture of St Ursula. And under the emotional stress, he came near to insanity. And it was in 1878 that he was to break down completely for the first time. I like to think that this rather nervous, scribbly drawing of 1877 shows the kind of mental strain that he was feeling under. Well, although Ruskin had hinted at the experience caused by Carpaccio's picture in earlier numbers of Fors Clavigera, written in Venice. Ruskin does not mention it again in April. He'd already, this morning, revealed a great deal about himself through Tintoretto, Veronese, Giotto. Carpaccio might have revealed too much. Instead, he abruptly cuts short his account with a challenge from the Sheffield workers he was supposed to be addressing. "But what's all this about Titian and Angelico to you, are you thinking? We belong to cotton mills, iron mills. What is Titian to us?" Belatedly, he tries to return to his original purpose, but now there is no time to explain the creed and beliefs of the Guild of St George. All he can offer is the promise that if his Sheffield workers persevere, the significance of Angelico and Titian for iron workers will eventually become clear. So, neither the Creed of St George nor his autobiography was ever finished. Like so many of his drawings, such as the study of the facade of St Mark's, the little sketch of his life was left incomplete. But it can still suggest a great deal. It is clear that he did not have the sort of mind that went straight forward on a single line of argument. He worked less by a process of analysis in which ideas are separated one from another and broken down than by synthesis, gradually drawing ideas together into a whole. It's the method of the painter as opposed to the scientist, and the crucial changes in his life that took place in front of painting show that the faculty of sight was all important to him. His whole method depended on visual observation, and visual experiences were the turning points in his life. Ruskin wrote in Modern Painters, "The greatest thing a human soul ever does in this world is to see something and tell what it saw in a plain way. Hundreds can talk for one who can think, but thousands can think for one who can see. To see clearly is poetry, prophecy, and religion all in one." Ruskin devoted his life to saying what he saw, though not always in a plain way. Poetry, prophecy, and religion were never far away. But I do hope that it is now clearer what I mean by the argument of the eye. Thank you very much.